Jesse James. You hear that name and you immediately think Wild West legend, right? But the actual man behind that myth, well, that is a much, much darker and more violent story. Today, we're going to peel back those layers of legend to find the real person underneath. So on the left, you've got the legend, the handsome, defiant rebel. This is the image we've all seen in movies, the one that's been romanticized for more than a century. But on the right, that's the grim reality, a post-mortem photograph taken right after he was killed. The gap between these two pictures, that's the gap between myth and history. So let's just dive right in. Was he really a champion for the common folk, or was he a cold-blooded murderer? To figure that out, we have to separate the Hollywood fiction from the hard historical facts. Okay, let's get one thing straight right off the bat. The whole Robin Hood story, it's a total myth. I mean, completely made up. Historians are all in agreement here. There is zero, and I mean zero, evidence that Jesse James or his gang ever shared their stolen money with anyone. So if he wasn't a hero to the poor, where did his story actually begin?
To really understand the outlaw, we have to go back to the brutal conflict that created him, the American Civil War. This wasn't just some historical backdrop for Jesse James. It was his entire origin story.
Jesse grew up in a part of Missouri they called Little Dixie, and the name really says it all, right? His family were fierce Confederates, and yes, they owned slaves. Let's be very clear about which side they were on. And since Missouri was a border state, it was just torn apart by this incredibly savage and personal kind of guerrilla warfare. As a teenager, Jesse joined up with a group of pro-Confederate fighters known as bushwhackers. Now, these were not regular soldiers. They were insurgents, and they committed horrific acts of violence, targeting not just Union troops, but civilians too. This was the school where Jesse James learned his trade. His path to becoming an outlaw was swift, and it was bloody. At just 16, he was riding with guys like the notorious Bloody Bill Anderson. And he wasn't just tagging along. He took part in the Centralia Massacre, where these guerrillas executed unarmed Union soldiers, even scalping and dismembering some of them. This is the brutal reality that the legend just conveniently forgets.
After the war was officially over, the fighting didn't stop for Jesse James. It just changed form. His career as an outlaw was really a direct continuation of his time as a guerrilla, targeting symbols of the Union and the Republican government that he hated.
So, what was the crime that launched him into national infamy? It was a bank robbery in Gallatin, Missouri. But this was never just about the money. Not even close.
You see, during the robbery, Jesse shot and killed the cashier, John Sheets. He did it because he thought Sheets was the Union officer who was responsible for killing his old wartime commander. It was a targeted political assassination disguised as a bank robbery. And this act of cold-blooded revenge is what put him on the map.
So how did people see him at the time? Not as a hero. A local history called it the blackest crime in the county's history. That whole romantic hero thing, that would come much, much later.
Now here's where the story gets absolutely fascinating. Jesse James didn't just commit crimes, he actually curated his own image. He started writing letters to the press, specifically to an editor who was a former Confederate, and was more than happy to help build the myth.
It was a masterful PR campaign. James would write these letters proclaiming his innocence, framing his crimes as some kind of Southern resistance. Then, the editor, John Newman Edwards, would publish them alongside editorials that painted James as this defiant Confederate hero. Together, they literally manufactured the legend in real time. For about a decade, the James Younger gang seemed totally unstoppable. But their reign of terror and all that carefully crafted propaganda was about to come crashing to a halt in a small Minnesota town. The target was the First National Bank of Northfield. The gang rode into town thinking it would be an easy score, far away from their usual stomping grounds. They were dead wrong. Oh man, everything that could go wrong did. The cashier, a man named Joseph Lee Haywood, bravely refused to open the safe, and they murdered him for it. But the townspeople didn't run and hide. No way. They grabbed their guns and fought back, shooting gang members right there in the street. In the end, only Frank and Jesse managed to get away. The legendary James Younger gang was utterly destroyed, finished. Jesse escaped Northfield, but the end of his gang really marked the beginning of his own end. He was a changed man, paranoid, and his famous crew was gone. His story wasn't going to end in a blaze of glory, but with a final, quiet betrayal. $10,000. In the 1880s, that was an unimaginable fortune. We're talking enough money to buy several huge farms, and that was the bounty on his head. It basically made Jesse James a walking target.
Feeling the heat, James recruited a new, smaller gang. He started to trust two brothers, Robert and Charlie Ford, so much so that he invited them to live in his own home. This would be his final and fatal mistake.
It was just a quiet moment at home. James, feeling safe for once, actually took his guns off, something he almost never did. He stood on a chair to straighten a dusty picture, and, with his back turned, Robert Ford shot him in the back of the head. The great outlaw was killed, unarmed, by a man he had welcomed into his house.
And the aftermath was just as shocking. The Fords were arrested, convicted of murder, and sentenced to death. And then, on the very same day, they got a full pardon from the governor. This pretty much suggested that the state had conspired to have James assassinated rather than captured, an act that only added to his notoriety. In death, Jesse James became so much more powerful than he ever was in life. The story of his betrayal became the final, crucial ingredient in transforming a brutal killer into a tragic folk hero. The myth-making started at his own gravesite. His mother, Zerelda, wrote this epitaph, framing him as a beloved son and a victim, murdered by a coward. This narrative, the fallen rebel, betrayed by a traitor, would come to define his legacy. So, it all comes down to this, doesn't it? The myth we all know is the American Robin Hood, but the reality? He was a product of the Civil War's sheer brutality, a terrorist, a robber, and a murderer who used the press to build a legend that just wasn't true. Which leaves us with one final, lingering question. For more than a century, this romantic legend has completely overshadowed the violent reality. Why do we prefer the myth to the man?